We are very lucky that we have Jarkko here today to tell us a little bit about forest genetic resources. I think most of us, when we studied forestry, had a course on forest genetic resources. But clearly, when we then start our work, we work more on what we can see. And what we can see are sort of the forests and the trees. And we don't necessarily see what lies behind that and make sure that we have the right kind of trees and the right provenances of the trees in order to make sure that we have the material that we need in order to reach the goals that we set ourselves for the management of those forests. We also, I hope all of you know, how important genetic resources will be, particularly now that we're talking about climate change and how that's affecting the various types, particularly of trees, of course, that we have in forests, but also other plants, and how we, through the knowledge that we have on genetic resources, can help better adapt to climate change. I haven't spoken to Jarkko on what he's going to include in his presentation. I'm sure that he will cover all of this. Clearly, also a number of other aspects as well. As you know, we are gearing up to prepare the state of the world's forest genetic resources that will come out in 2023. It's a major effort at the same scope, if you will, on our global forest resources assessment. We're focusing on different levels. And we also have a global plan of action on forest genetic resources. So I'll tell you a little bit about what that is and how we're doing in terms of implementing that. But there are lots and lots of links between genetic resources and climate change, aspects related to biodiversity, of course, related also to combating desertification. So with the big environmental agreements and conventions that are there, and many more. So I won't say more, I'll leave it to Jarkko, but I will ask you all to come around here. There's a space here, I don't bite. And I'll also say that we are filming this so that we can share it also with our regional colleagues, some of whom are not yet awake, and some of them are certainly have at the end of their working day. So we'll make sure that they can see it from the Forestry Technical Network website. So, Jarkko, thank you so much for coming here and explaining to us what forest genetic resources are and why they are so important.
Thank you, Mette, and good morning, colleagues, and those who are online. So as Mette mentioned, I will tell a few basic things about forest genetic resources we all should be aware while working at the forestry department. And also I will, at the end of my presentation, also provide some details about the global plan of action, was also mentioned by Mette, as well as the plans for preparing the second report on the state of the world's forest genetic resources and how this normative work on forest genetic resources could be used by the country offices and countries themselves. Okay, so to start with the definition. So we're talking about the heritable materials maintained within and among tree and other woody plant species, which have either the actual or potential economic, environmental, scientific, or societal value. And basically, we are not talking about everything you can find in forest, but focusing on trees, woody shrubs, palms, and also bamboos, which are managed in the forestry context, including, of course, agroforestry for various whether wood or non-wood products and different services. 2 years ago, the Botanical Gardens Conservation International, they launched a new database called Global Tree Search, and they basically put together list of all tree species known by science, and they now established more firmly that globally we have some bit more than 60,000 tree species. And almost half of these, or 45%, are basically found in just 3 families, and almost 58% of the species are single country endemics. And if you look at the top 10 genera, you can find many of the tree species widely also used in forestry, and of course those which are occurring in a native forest. And if you look at the countries, Brazil is topping the list with more than 8,700 tree species. And of course then we have many other tropical countries in Latin America and in Asia, and also Madagascar in Africa. So trees are obviously foundation species of forest ecosystems. So if trees are managing well, the likelihood is high that also the whole forest ecosystem is doing fine. So why forest genetic resources or diversity matters? Well, first of all, the genetic diversity is the foundation for other levels of biological diversity at the species and ecosystem levels. Genetic diversity also ensures that trees can survive, adapt, and evolve under changing environmental conditions, and they are also important for maintaining the vitality of forests and provides resilience to pests and diseases. The graph here shows that in the past 10 or 15 years, in the research front, have been new evidence that actually the genetics was long time focusing on, of course, at the population level, but there's new evidence that the adaptive traits, let's say tree species, actually reflect to the higher levels in the community and even ecosystems, and then this has brought Americans a new discipline in science called the community or ecosystem genetics. So it's not only looking what happens at the population level, whether they are tree species or other species, but the whole system. Of course, we then all know that trees provide multiple products and services, and they are, of course, very important for the local communities in different parts of the world. And, well, wood is obviously an important forest product, but we have then various non-wood forest products, fruits, nuts, barks, and so forth, which are used extensively by the local communities. Then a few words how genetic diversity is measured. As usually assessed with the molecular markers. Here we see two different types of microsatellite markers, and basically this is looking at the DNA level, what can be found and how the diversity can be characterized. So of course this is something you cannot see if you just look trees as such. This is also called sort of a neutral genetic diversity, in a sense that many of these molecular markers, you can find diversity, but you cannot link that directly to the adaptive traits, let's say growth, or if you have actual traits. More recently, there's only, let's say, past 5 or 10 years, some new markers which can then also quantify the adaptive diversity. Well, traditionally, the adaptive diversity is basically measured by provenance trials, basically collecting seeds of tree species across its distribution range, and then having these all seed sources established in one site, or as in this case, in several sites, so we can have the sort of a response curve, how different seed sources are in this case adjusting to different climatic conditions. Other thing good to keep in mind when we talk about the forest genetic resources, when we compare that to the genetic resources of agricultural crops, the forest genetic resources are basically still wild. We only have very few tree species which have been domesticated to the level of similar to the agricultural crops. Of course, we have fruit trees, but in the forestry context, we may have some species of eucalypts and poplars, which are more advanced. And of course, this means that the conservation approach for forest genetic resources is quite different from those applied to the crop genetic resources. So first of all, just that the nature of most tree species are still wild, meaning that they're in the continuous evolution. And when we try to conserve forest genetic resources, we are not trying to capture or maintain the genetic diversity you can find in certain moment of time. But the effort is to make sure that the evolutionary processes continue and can continuously shape the genetic diversity. And for this reason, the in situ approach is the preferred approach for forest genetic resources, meaning that it's a dynamic, it allows the continuous evolution of tree populations, whether they are specific tree in reserve forest or within protected areas. Ex situ conservation is then used as a complementary, especially for the tree populations which are low in number of individuals, and that's static in the sense that it maintains the once collected sample of genetic diversity, whether they are in the field collections, seed banks, or in cryopreservation, meaning you put the plant material into the liquid nitrogen. And of course, you can conserve them by using, whether it's on farms or as part of the forest management. Well, then moving to looking at the management of forest genetic resources, we have many textbooks and good guidelines available, but there's a persisting problem that the genetic aspects are often neglected in planning and implementing forest management, and also biodiversity conservation. And of course, genetic resources is only one aspect of, let's say, sustainable forest management. But I think it's critical that forest managers and policymakers, and of course all FAO staff, understand or are aware of the point where ignoring these genetic aspects may lead to failures and prevent the achievement of whether it's the field projects or the national goals related to forest management, restoration, and biodiversity conservation. Well, like as many of you are very aware of the restoration challenge, we have millions of hectares pledged for restoration, and I think it's close to 300 million hectares. Different countries around the world have pledged to restore, and of course this creates some challenges. And if you look at the recent global survey done by colleagues at Biodiversity International, looking at 139 forest and landscape restoration projects in 57 countries. So this study identified quite a bit of problems in terms of the availability of tree seeds and also the diversity included. So here are some numbers from the study. So 78% of the projects often experienced problems in obtaining seed. Quite a few of them, 65%, also had problems actually finding suitable seed sources for the restoration efforts. And this project report that these problems then led into the higher costs using less species that was originally planned, and often delays in carrying out the activities. But I think the last point is particularly worrying, that nearly 40% of the projects reported that they are restoring the same sites again. Of course, this means that it becomes even more difficult to meet the restoration goals. Then I brought this forest and tree cover transition curve from the FGR research program on forest, trees and agroforest. I think it's useful in the sense that often when we talk about forest genetic resources, many people think that it's only relevant when you're trying to restore or do the reforestation. But actually it cuts across all of these curves, so that you have also some genetic aspects you need to be aware when you are managing the existing forest, whether it's the old growth forest or locked over or degraded to some extent. So for the next couple of slides, I would like to go through these following points. Basically, first, which are then relevant for planning and implementing forest management and related activities and projects. First, looking at the special features of trees, then some key genetic considerations in managing existing forest, as well as establishing new forest, and then looking at the supply of forest reproductive material a bit also. Well, in evolutionary terms, trees are among the planet's most successful types of organisms. They have been around for a long time. If you look at some species of conifers, they already existed when we had dinosaurs roaming around here. And they have quite a number of features which makes them different from the other plant species even. First, of course, they are large and long-lived. And if you look at throughout their lifetime, they have the high reproductive output, meaning that they produce a lot of seeds and offspring and so forth. Of course, the drawback is that many tree species, before they reach the reproductive age, that can be 1 year or 2 years, in some cases even 30 years, or in some dipterocarps even up to 45 years before they start producing seeds. Also, most tree species have high genetic diversity within their populations rather than among the populations. So this means that if you sample a few tree populations, you are most likely capturing large part of the genetic diversity of that species. Of course, we then have exceptions. One you can find outside of FAO, the Italian stone pine. That's one of the few species which have actually low genetic diversity. And for that we can thank the ancient Romans. They did a good job spreading the seeds around the Mediterranean from the eastern part of the Mediterranean. Trees also accumulate new mutation slowly. Then they also have high local differentiation in adaptive traits, despite the fact that they often have a high and extensive gene flow in the form of pollen and seed dispersal. And also they maintain quite well their species integrity. Well, if you look really far away in the past 10,000 years or so, the distribution ranges of trees have been continuously contracting, expanding, or shifting in the past, depending on the climatic conditions. This has been well documented with the temperate and boreal tree species, from which, of course, have left traces of pollen in the ground. And this has been quite established for these tree species, but we also have a new evidence that these climatic changes which caused the glacial periods in the boreal and temperate regions, they also shaped the past distribution ranges of tropical tree species, where of course you cannot track this with the pollen, but the new molecular markers have allowed scientists to study how tropical tree species have also evolved. Other special feature of trees is that the trees have what is called the high phenotypic plasticity, meaning that, of course, the long period they are living, they have plenty of diversity even within one generation to cope with changing climatic conditions throughout their lifetime, whether it's 100 years, 200 years, or even more. Also, we have evidence that, of course, adaptation then, if you look at it from the biological point of view, that's something which happens over the generations. But we have evidence that in some cases, of course, the adaptation can happen fast in trees, meaning over one generation. And of course, migration is then a bit more slower process. Some more special features of trees. If you look at the reproductive biology, we have trees they have the male and female reproductive organs in the same individual. Then we have tree species which you can find these separated, so you have male trees and female trees. So this is something that needs to be taken into account when managing tree species. Also, they differ in seed biology. I think 70% of the tropical tree species have a recalcitrant or intermediate seed behavior. So this means that when the seeds have matured, they start losing their viability, and you basically cannot store them for a long period of time. And then the opposite is the orthodox seed behavior, looking at the eucalyptus, pines, acacias, for example, where you can store the seeds in a low humidity and cool temperatures for 20 or 30 years without major problems in losing the viability of the seeds. And of course, then we have some other particular cases, like most of the mangrove tree species. They have a viviparous seeds, or actually seedlings. So basically, the seeds are already germinating in the tree, and they drop to the water, and they are sort of living seedlings already when they drop down. One more example here again, the Parkia species from Africa. So this species have female and male reproductive organs in the same tree. It's predominantly outcrossing, meaning that the fruits are pollinated by other individuals, not by itself. It's pollinated by bats, honeybees, or other stingless bees, and then the seed is dispersed by primates, rodents, and birds. So of course, then it's also important to know whether a species is wind-pollinated or animal-pollinated, and what are the pollinating agents, and how that seed is dispersed. Then looking at the few genetic considerations in managing the existing forest. But the first point is to be aware that harvesting both wood or non-wood forest product can have quite significant impacts on the tree population. I guess, well, wood harvesting is an obvious case. If you're harvesting wood, you are basically killing it, and you are reducing the population size. But usually, when you're harvesting, these trees have usually contributed to the reproduction already. But in other cases, non-wood forest products like nuts and fruits, of course, if you collect all of them, what one tree population is producing, you prevent the natural regeneration. Then there have been quite a lot of studies looking at the impacts of different silvicultural systems on genetic diversity, but this depends very much on the species and the biology and ecology, and basically which sort of forest you are. Often we have sort of tree species which are stand-forming. You can find them in the big stands. In these cases, if you have thinnings and so forth, you usually have quite minimal impact on the genetic diversity. The situation can be different if you move to the sort of scattered tree species, which you often find in tropical forest. They may have only a few individuals per hectare, or even less. So of course here, if you have the selective locking scheme defining what is then the size in which you start doing the selective locking, and what is then how that relates to the reproductive age of the species, where they already start producing seeds and so forth. And of course, in many cases, efforts always or guidelines emphasize the role of natural regeneration. Of course, that depends on the past use history of the stand. Now is maybe the degradation and fragmentation, how well natural regeneration can actually succeed. Well, then when you're aiming at establishing a new forest, well, you can plant trees for many different purposes, but of course the basic requirement here is that you have adequate supply of seed or other reproductive material which is of high physiological and genetic quality. And also the seed source used should be well adapted to the planting site. And of course then seeds must be collected from the sufficient number of trees. The genetic theory has provided some numbers, so 50 or 500 individuals, the rule of thumb. Well, basically the 50 comes at, with that number, you're most likely able to avoid the inbreeding depression. And the 500, basically you would have then enough diversity that the mutation would be able to offset the genetic drift, basically how the genetic diversity is randomly shaping. But we know that, of course, this is theory and the situation is quite different in practice. This theory expects that all trees in the, all these trees would be participating in the reproduction, but we know that the effective population size, meaning that those trees which in a given year participate in the reproduction process, is not the same that all individuals you can find in the moment. So it's minus something, but that's very difficult to establish in practice and in the field conditions. And how is that? But of course, if you look very real rule of thumb, if you go beyond 20 trees, you may have the problems. Usually if you stay, well, of course, the more the better, but if you go below 20, you're most likely to have problems. And of course, when the seed collection is being done, the seeds should be collected not from the neighboring trees. So distance like 100 meters between the trees would be, again, useful, but that's sometimes very difficult to ensure in practice. Well, matching the seed source with the planting site has a long history in the forestry, and this is just to show the climatic zones in Mexico and how the colleagues at CONAFOR have used that information to divide the country into the seed zones, or used as sometimes people use also the provenance regions as a name. So basically here these roughly follow the climatic and also sometimes the soil conditions. Some example of the inbreeding depression, meaning that if you have only seeds collected from the very few trees, so what happens in the subsequent generations. So here one study using Acacia mangium in Malaysia, looking at in 3 generations how it has impacted or decreased the height of the ceiling, which can also be considered as a adaptive trait reflecting the genetic diversity. Then a few words about the forest reproductive material, which means seeds, cuttings, or other reproductive parts of tree. The obtaining forest reproductive material involves a number of steps, which actually can take a number of years to put in place. You first have to identify what is the species you want to plant, what are the seed sources, or whether then you might be using individuals or different clones. How to organize the seed collection and procurement, handling and seed storage, the possible pre-treatments, breaking the seed dormancy, or doing the inoculation with the mycorrhiza. And then, of course, seedling transportation and actual production. And another feature of many tree species is that you don't get a good seed crop every year. Many species have sort of must years, so you may have tropical species, it may take once in 7 years, once in 10 years. Then depends on where you are. If you're in a temperate or boreal species, the temperature condition may result that you may get 2 or 3 good seed years in 100 years. So this means that you need to plan the seed collection well. You need to know where to collect and when to collect. And of course then you need to make sure that if you have the seed biology that you can actually store, so that you have the annual supply of seeds for actually growing seedlings for planting. Well, in the best case, countries may have breeding programs in place, but currently only about 700 tree species are included in breeding programs. And of course, there you start with the selection of the natural stands, and then collect material from them. You establish breeding population, you test them, and then do the recycle. At the moment, we have the most advanced tree breeding at the end of third or fourth generation. So tree breeding is quite new. Globally, I think it's only in 1950s when many countries established their first tree breeding programs. And of course, then is the production of the material, whether it comes from the tree breeding program or the actual stands, but that's then much more straightforward. And actually many countries, they have the issue that they collect directly from the wild stands, maybe doing some sort of selection, and then try to produce the seedlings to match the needs. Of course, then we have a number of tree species which may have some, let's say, problems, or they are more difficult to produce adequate amounts of seeds, even if you have breeding programs or seed stands in place. And teak, for example, is a good example of this. The problem being that even the tree seed orchard and the natural stands, they produce not so much seeds. So this has raised to the sort of interest to produce the planting material using the micro propagation. Actually, this company in Malaysia has done collaboration with Chirac in France for 20 or 30 years, and they have done or achieved the good results. And the picture you can see here actually is the 7 years old teak, which is, for a teak, it's quite good. And they have basically producing now quite a lot of clonal teak material for planting, and from Malaysia they are also supplying to many other regions of the world. And they rely about 20 or 30 clones. And interesting enough, many of the best performing clones, they are not, of course, originally from Malaysia. Teak is not, that also been introduced into Malaysia, but they also have in the neighboring countries where they have collected the material. So even the best performing clones are not those ones they have originally introduced to Malaysia. Well, many countries, even starting from the 60s and 70s, they have established the National Tree Seed Center. You can see the picture from last week in Ghana. They just opened the day center just about a year ago. And this is sort of that traditionally the whole sort of national tree seed system or program, they have been traditionally built around the National Tree Seed Center, which have then given the responsibility of sourcing the material, collecting the seed, processing and storing for the needs of the different stakeholders. Of course, that model worked early in the past quite well if you had the sort of industrial scale tree plantation, and colleagues from ICRAF, they have also pointed out that in many studies that that model had some limitations actually reaching out or providing the material to all the smallholders, and especially in case of the agroforestry tree species. So they call it the broken chain. And of course, yet it's good to know that forest reproductive material is part of the bigger or longer value chain if we are producing different material. Well, then moving to the FAO's work on forest-genetic resources, it was back in 50 years ago when FAO started working on forest-genetic resources. In that year, the FAO Conference established the panel of experts on forest gene resources. And many of these activities, seed collection, exploring, establishing provenance trials, conservation efforts and so forth, have been included in our work on forest genetic resources in the past. And this is also, of course, partly ongoing. More recently, we have the work is now becoming under the umbrella of the Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. This is the FAO body, which basically most of the FAO members are also members of this commission. It was established back in 1983, focusing first to the crop genetic resources, but in 1995 its mandate was broadened to cover also the other components of biodiversity relevant for food and agriculture, including forest genetic resources. It was back in 2007 when this commission requested FAO to prepare the first State of the World's Forest Genetic Resources report, which was also mentioned Mette in her introduction. I assume many of you are already familiar. The Commission also established in 2009 the Intergovernmental Technical Working Group on Forest Genetic Resources, and then considered the draft of the global report back in 2013. Well, just to highlight that this report was prepared basically mainly between 2010 2012, involving regional and sub-regional workshops, thematic studies, and of course country reports similar to what countries are reporting to the Global Forest Resources Assessment. So the first report was based on country reports from 86 countries, and almost 8,000 tree species were mentioned in the country reports, and approximately half of these were reported to be threatened or subject to genetic erosion. Well, the findings of the report can be summarized in these 4 points. Basically, there's a need to improve the availability and access to information on genetic resources. Secondly, to improve the conservation efforts, both in situ and ex situ. Sustainable use, development and management we also identified as a priority area for action, as well as policies, institutions and capacity building. And of course these findings led then to the developing the global plan of action, and there the Intergovernmental Technical Working Group played the part, and the Commission then agreed the priorities as the global plan of action, and the document was finally adopted by the FAO Conference in 2013. So the global plan of action is also based on these 4 priority areas for action. Many of the priorities focus on what needs to be done at the national level, but they also include what should be done at the regional and the global level. And of course, it depends in which country and region you are, how relevant a given priority is. Well, in the implementation of the global plan of action, the regional networks on forest genetic resources have taken an active role. An example here is the Asia-Pacific Forest Genetic Resources Program, or AFOGEN, which first identified regional priorities in 2014, so soon after the global plan of action was finalized, and then developed a regional strategy for its implementation in 2017. And also this was presented to the FAO Asia-Pacific Forestry Commission in 2017, and they welcomed this and invited the network also to FAO to collaborate with the network and then to report back to the Commission on this implementation. Something similar took place in Africa, where we were organizing a workshop for the Sub-Saharan Africa Forest and Resources Program in Cameroon in 2016. They also drafted a regional strategy, and we had just last week again a regional workshop looking at how and what sort of progress the countries have been making in this regard. The Commission on Genetic Resources, they have also tried to encourage and support the implementation in a number of ways. And in this regard, we have prepared the implementation strategy in 2015, targets, indicators, and verifiers for actually monitoring the progress in this regard. And then earlier this year, the Commission also adopted the voluntary guidelines for preparing a national strategy for forest genetic resources and also the funding strategy. Basically, just a few words about these targets and indicators we are using for the monitoring. The first set is sort of focusing what sort of responses countries should take in respect to the global plan of action. So whether they have specific inventory on genetic resources in place, information systems, conservation programs, tree seed systems, possible breeding programs, extension efforts on promoting the use of genetic resources, the national coordination mechanism, and so forth. And secondly, we are trying to track and ask countries to provide more species specific data, whether they have the national distribution range available, have they done characterization, what is included in the conservation programs, tree seed systems, and tree breeding programs, and so forth. We have just finalized the first report on the implementation of the global plan of action. That was started back in 2017. And last year we presented the draft report to the technical working group. And then in February this year, the Commission considered the final report, which was based on inputs from 44 countries, one regional network, and one international organization. So of course we had only a limited number of country reports, so we cannot make very comprehensive conclusions. But we can find that in several countries have taken action or started action as a response to the global plan of action. In these 44 countries, the situation is quite good. When you look at these different mechanisms or programs in place. But then when we go to the species-specific data, we have some challenges. Countries reported more than 1,100 tree species, but still we know that many more species are used in forestry in many countries. We have also developed for the first set of targets and indicators sort of a dashboard. You can see the progress. So green means that countries have achieved something, yellow they have started, red they still have some work to do, and the gray one is countries didn't have information to report. This is just basically the same for the European countries, which were mostly half of the reporting countries. Well, this is just some numbers for the species-specific data we got, and indicating that we still have quite a bit of to go regarding those number of tree species countries reported for the first global assessment report. Well, then to end my presentation, a few words about the preparation of the second report on the state of the world's forest genetic resources. So this is part of the schedule for monitoring the implementation of the global plan of action, where the Commission has given a timeline for us to prepare the report. And also earlier this year, the Commission adopted the outline for the report, as well as the reporting guidelines. And as a new feature, we are also requested to develop a new global information system on forest genetic resources, basically making available all the data and information we are collecting as part of this exercise. the process will start this year, actually next month. FAO will invite countries to provide the inputs for this. And what we do now is that we are repeating the second assessment cycle for the implementation of the global plan of action. And also the same data will be used to prepare the second global report. We already have the guidelines approved. They're available in English, and we are now trying to make them, of course, available in other languages. And for the countries, they basically have to provide one country reports, but with two sections providing information for the two purposes. Well, briefly the outline. First of all, trying to make the case why forest-centric resources are relevant for sustainable development. The part two will be focusing, trying to summarize first the results of the FRA, which is going to be released next year. Then look at what is the state of other wooded lands. Then looking at the state of diversity at the species level. The Botanical Gardens Conservation International and IUCN, they are currently calling, having an initiative called the Global Tree Assessment. Basically, they're trying to go through all these 60,000 tree species and establish the conservation status. And then we will also go looking at what we know on actually the genetic diversity of different tree species. We will then on looking at the state of conservation efforts, state of use, development and management, and how are the capacities and policies changed since the first report. And lastly, we are then trying to find or summarize the findings to see whether the Commission then needs to update the global plan of action for the future. So basically here are the main steps. The deadline for the countries to submit these country reports are June next year. We will then start processing the data. And basically the plan is to have a number of expert meetings in 2021 and then start writing up the report. We should present the first draft in May 2022 for the working group. And then the draft would go to the Commission in early 2023, and depending on the recommendations and guidance from the Commission, we would then need to finalize the report. Well, just to highlight also that in February, the Commission on Genetic Resources also adopted the funding strategy, and here the idea is that countries are encouraged actively to mainstream forest-centric resources into broader and larger actions on forest-centric resources, forest management, or forest-based climate actions, and then also to have more specific projects on forest-centric resources depending on their needs. And that's, I will conclude here, and well, just to, at the end to highlight that, of course, we have two modules in a sustainable forest management toolbox, which provides you more information. Also the Climate Smart Agriculture Sourcebook. There's a module on genetic resources, and there's a sub-module on forest-centric resources. Some recent publications, like the one on looking at the genetic considerations in forest restoration, and also the thematic studies were published in the special issue of Forest Ecology and Management. They are freely available. And also we have many older guidelines, which are now produced some 15 years ago, but these are still useful in providing the basic concepts and methods for managing forest-centric resources. And furthermore, we are currently migrating or developing a new website for forest-centric resources, and well, hopefully this might be available also by the end of May at this point. We have some challenges here, but anyway, that's in the pipeline. So thank you for listening, and to open the floor for the questions. Ben.
Sure, I'll break the ice. Thanks for the great presentation. It was useful. It seems like you're doing something that's still relatively new for FAO, even though it has a very strong foundation. And any number of countries we would like to begin getting involved in forest genetic resources conservation. Not having read, I confess, the plan of action recently. What would be the ask? What's the first step for a country to get involved? You always want to have something short, simple, maybe relatively easy. If we happen to run into somebody who would be interested or who it might be a relevant topic to, but they don't know about it, what would we say? How would we say that we were asking countries to begin?
Well, thanks, Benny, for the question. Those who have read it, as I mentioned, I mean, there are a lot of priorities which are identified there. But I think the first for the countries is to look at these 4 priority areas: what the information they have available, what is conserved, how is it used, and what are then the needs at the policy and the capacity building area. I think countries should not jump into the individual priorities. And I think, the first step is, of course, when we have also developed the guidelines for preparing a national strategy on forest genetic resources. Because we have the case that, of course, many countries, for example, they have developed the national forest programs. And FAO has been, of course, supporting the development of these programs. But in many cases, even the national forest programs, they say very little about the forest genetic resources. I think the first is to countries to kind of identify what it wants to achieve in terms of forest management, restoration goals. And of course, from there then to start looking at what information, what forest genetic resources it has available and so forth, sort of coming backwards.
Thank you. Very interesting and useful presentation. You mentioned that genetic aspects are often neglected in planning. It's presumably because there is not much information there, right? And in your experience, could you also give some examples, real-world examples where it was neglected and made a major impact afterwards? We know that, restoration programs, you gave some examples, but are there any examples you are aware of which we can bring it, to build the case?
Well, I think there are a number of examples. I mean, usually, I think many mistakes have been made at matching the seed source with the planting site. That's often where, even if you have enough diversity, but the seed source doesn't match either the soil or the climatic conditions of the planting site. So that's the maybe most classical problem. But of course, if you look at the other sort of what is often assumed is that the local seed source is always the best. But we have ample of evidence from the research and provenance trial that often this is not the case. Like the one slide I showed that this response functions. So usually you have that we have seed sources which sort of perform moderately across different sites. Then we have some sources which may be performing well, but of course then you have this kind of response curve that there is some sort of variation how a given seed source is growing in a certain conditions. And of course I think then one example is in the face of climate change. Many countries in different parts, they are also looking at or considering changing species they are planting. And I think that's not yet the case. I mean, if you have already 3 species in use, you should first look at different seed sources or different provenances. So not directly thinking of changing a species altogether, but looking at the maybe the other seed sources, maybe from your neighboring countries. Because many tree species used in the forestry, they have quite large distribution range. So this is just a few examples. Anybody else? Christina?
Thank you very much. I actually have 2 questions.
Okay, even better.
The first one is more about, I was interested in knowing, you mentioned there's 3 seed centers. Mm-hmm. Do you know who are those champion countries, who has the best centers? It's just for my learning purposes. I mean, maybe I would believe Brazil, but maybe it's not the case, or Malaysia. So which are the countries that has the best maybe practices and the best centers, and who can teach other countries? If you know the examples. Yeah. This is the first, maybe then I'll ask.
Okay, thanks. Well, actually, all of the regions we have several countries which have quite well-functioning tree-seed system in place. I was just last week in Ghana. I mentioned they have now established tree-seed center. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa, we have countries like Burkina Faso. They have well-been functioning, and many of those colleagues who are involved in the action against desertification know that like Burkina Faso, they have been supplying for the neighboring countries also material. In Asia, of course, we have China. They have done massive work on restoring and restoration efforts. But then also countries like Vietnam, Thailand, and so forth. So there are many examples of well-functioning tree-seed systems.
Thank you, Jarkko. And the second question is actually about the wildlife. So because wildlife plays quite an important role in different ecological processes, for example, the seed dispersal. So my question would be, maybe to which extent wildlife is reflected in the global plan of action, or maybe if there is any request from countries to include wildlife. So maybe the first one, if it's reflected at all, or maybe if it is, but to which extent. Mm-hmm. So just interested, in knowing and maybe even incorporating wildlife in the work you do, because I think it's quite important.
Well, if I recall correctly, I think there's no reference to wildlife in the global plan of action. But of course, we know that, as you mentioned, in this pollination and seed dispersal, the wildlife plays an important role. Of course, we have then larger animals which also shape the forest ecosystem, which can be then even destructive for some of the tree populations. So obviously, there's a clear linkage with the wildlife issues, and I think we should maybe look this also in the context of protected area management, because also one specific feature of, if you're looking at the conservation at the genetic level, because if you have protected areas, they are usually established for protecting wildlife, animals, or habitats. In many cases, there's no consideration given what sort of genetic diversity you might find there. So that's also an area where I think the genetic aspects could be incorporated. And of course, if you look at the wildlife management, there of course genetic resources of game animals, there's some elements which could be also taken into account. Okay. Doug?
Thanks, Jarkko. That was a good presentation, good overview. Just to point out, people may already be aware, but we have the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration that will begin 2021 and go through 2030. And I think it's still being discussed how exactly that decade is going to be structured. But both FAO and UN Environment will be leading the observance of that decade. And I think we have an opportunity at some point to put emphasis on forest genetic resources and the whole issue of genetic resources in restoration. Maybe we would think about coinciding with the release of the next State of the World report, or shortly thereafter, but 2023, 2024. I mean, the advantage of having a decade, obviously, is that it gives us a long duration and possibly a way to deal with some of these issues in an ongoing way. Whereas an international year gives us a pretty short window, this could be a really good opportunity to start to look at what's needed to kind of get the awareness level and the action level up in terms of FGR and restoration, and maybe develop a plan that would roll out over that 10-year period. So just to flag that, I think it's going to be a good opportunity.
Thanks, Doug. This is indeed useful, and I think hopefully from this presentation you got the message that sometimes, of course, people think that forest genetic resources are, as a topic, something complicated. But I think the basic, it's about supply and demand, and with rather basic guidelines, you can incorporate the genetic diversity in the restoration efforts or managing the existing forest. So that's sort of, I fully agree what you said, Dr. Pierre?
Thank you very much, Jarkko, for your presentation. I would have a question on the figure you mentioned, that there is 60,000 tree species in the world, according to the current inventory. And in the national reports that you received, so from 86 countries representing 85% of the forest in the world, there were only 8,000 tree species. So for the next report, do you have partners that could help fill the gap and help countries to better evaluate, assess their genetic resources, and allow us to reach or to tend towards 60,000 species in the national reports?
Thank you, Pierre, for the question. Well, first of all, I think the aim of the second report is not to cover all those 60,000 tree species. But of course, well, we are already collaborating with the Botanic Gardens Conservation International. They have already agreed to summarize this global tree assessment, but they have planned to conclude it next year. So we get the global assessment of how many of these 60,000 tree species are endangered and which, according to which different IUCN categories. But of course, in the countries, they only manage, in a forestry context, a fraction of tree species. And we also have this 60,000, for example, it doesn't include the bamboo species. So, and it includes like some of the palms, which are considered as agricultural crops. We have oil palm, coffee, so we are not expecting countries to report oil palm. So it's not that what they have in the 60,000 is not exactly what we are kind of looking at. So of course then it's up to the countries to report what they consider important in a forestry context. So the amount of species what they might report comes from there. So just to clarify that we don't aim to cover all the 60,000. I mean, we have, I guess it was already nearly 60% of these are single country endemics. So of course these are not usually managed purposely in the forestry context or in agroforestry. So that's already explains quite a bit that we may have, I don't know, 10,000. Let's see. That depends, of course, how many countries will provide information.
One more question. Because in one of the earlier slides, you mentioned that the harvesting of wood products and non-wood forest products significantly impacts genetic diversity. So in this plan of action, are we also giving practical recommendations how we can optimize harvest levels to avoid the significant impact on genetic diversity?
Well, in a global plan of action, we don't have this level of details or guidelines, but we have other documentation and number of studies have been done. But this is quite, let's say, site or species specific. But there are a lot of research work have been done in this regard in different ecosystems. We have some species, of course, like the shea tree in Africa, or the Araucaria in Brazil, which have been, the Araucaria pod has been collected for the animal feed, and also the local communities are processing other products for the human consumption also. So of course there have been research work, that this extensive harvesting of the pods or the fruit not only endangered the natural regeneration. So we do have examples. Yeah.
Let me introduce my experience of tree improvement. I was the project manager in Indonesia. At that time, I wanted to develop the new species, especially the Massachusetts emily. Massachusetts emily good for the restoration in degraded land. And the Massachusetts emily was introduced from Africa to make the tea plantation, the coffee plantation or green tea plantation. It is the pest growing species, and straight cylinder and small diameter crown. It was very good for so Indonesian government asked me to develop the tree improvement. And I found the very pest growing the Massachusetts emily in Indonesia. So I collected around 109 mother tree all over Indonesia. And I make the experimental forest and I analyze the growth performance. But the result was the variation among the family was smaller than within the family. So I cannot write my doctor degree because the conclusion is so bad to me. And finally, I analyzed the DNA. So the genetic variation is too narrow because it was imported in same. I guess it was imported from one place, and then the reproducted. And so the family origin was only one, I think, my conclusion. So I recommended to, if the Indonesian government wanted to develop this species, had to maybe collect some information and import the other maybe region source to develop more, to make it more diverse. So I think the forest genetic resource, the database is very, I think it's useful for maybe developing new species. In Korea, at the time, 3 years ago, when I attended some the workshop, in Korea tried to develop the tree improvement, maybe the introduced from the other country, especially the Theta pinus from America. And Theta pinus is very good for the growth performance. So now the Korean government, some of the scientists wanted to develop tree improvement like me in Korea because it was already adopted environmentally. But I objected to that proposal because it's to have to narrow. I think to have to narrow the genetic resource. It is not to do the tree improvement. I think the forest resource genetic is very useful to if you establish that system.
Any other questions? Or no, and nothing either here online. So I guess thank you for your attention and hope you enjoyed the presentation.